These catastrophic pole shifts come in a periodic cycle of recurring and predictable cataclysms. Most people don't want to know this is coming. They don't want to know that America could replace Atlantis in legends of lost civilizations. One of the spacecraft's most significant accomplishments is to have taken readings of the comet's makeup, determining that it contains some of the basic building blocks of life. Interestingly, besides the obvious calamities such impacts would cause, such as firestorms, nuclear winters, and tsunamis, attention was drawn to various harmful chemicals that some comets contain. Magnetic pole shifts are in the news a lot recently because our magnetic North Pole is racing towards Russia, while the Earth's magnetic field strength is falling fast. The European Space Agency said this could be the beginning of a magnetic pole shift. Evidence suggests the rotational axis will also shift to stay aligned with the magnetic field. These catastrophic pole shifts come in a periodic cycle of recurring and predictable cataclysms, involving huge earthquakes and tsunamis, changes in latitude and altitude, mass extinctions, and the destruction of civilizations, reducing them to myth and legend. Most people don't want to know this is coming. They don't want to know that America could replace Atlantis in legends of lost civilizations. Your government censors the evidence to make sure you'll keep working and funding their preparations until it happens. But for those who are willing to look, the evidence exists. NASA computer simulation showing the differences of the Earth's magnetic field lines between and during a reversal of the north and south magnetic poles. The blue lines show when the field points towards the center and yellow when away. The rotation axis of the Earth is centered and vertical. The dense clusters of lines are within the Earth's core. Whenever there are shallow oceans near the Earth's equator, there are tropical coral reefs. Picture distinct stripes of coral species running parallel with the equator. If the surface of the Earth stayed fixed in its current orientation, there would be only one circle of coral reefs around our planet at our current equator. But instead, there are many bands of ancient coral crisscrossing the Earth, marking many previous equators. Charles Hapgood, author of The Earth's Shifting Crust, tells us there is even evidence of warm coralline seas stretching right across Antarctica. He cited coral expert Ting-Ying H-Ma of the University of Fujian. After studying corals in Alaska, Spitsbergen and Antarctica, Dr. Ma concluded that many total displacements of the entire outer crust of the Earth must have taken place. In Ma's words, the coral evidence he found could only be explained by the sudden sliding of the solid Earth shell over the liquid core, leading to a sudden change in latitudinal positions. When liquid lava flows from a volcano, it soon cools down and solidifies. In liquid form, ions of iron align themselves in the magnetic field of the Earth. We can analyze solid lava rock and determine which direction these molecules point forward, and it will indicate the direction of the magnetic pole at the time of solidification. The earliest analysis we've seen was published in 1955 by John W. Graham, and his conclusion was the rocks were magnetized by a geomagnetic field about like the one today. The essential difference being that this field was in a significantly different orientation. The result is discussed in terms of slip of an outer shell of the Earth relative to the axis of revolution. Lava fields at Steens Mountain in Oregon show North itself was moving up to 6 degrees per day while the lava cooled. Robert Coe and Michael Prevost published their initial analysis in 1989 under the title Evidence Suggesting Extremely Rapid Field Variation During a Geomagnetic Reversal, and noted that the magnetic field changes during solidification implies astonishing high rates of change in the geomagnetic field. The most likely explanation was rapid variation of the geomagnetic field direction during cooling. A mammoth-sized problem. The most famous flash-frozen mammoth carcer, the Berezovka mammoth, had many species of unchewed grasses, mosses, beans, and buttercups in its mouth and undigested in its stomach. Given the life cycle of these flowering plants, it was concluded that the mammoth died late in July or the beginning of August and was frozen almost instantly. Summer temperatures must have fallen very fast. Imagine how much body heat a mammoth must have while kept alive, and how much vegetation in stomach acid would deteriorate if not quickly frozen. What kind of temperature drop must have occurred to freeze a mammoth solid so quickly? Would a 60-degree drop in 2 hours be enough? Additional evidence suggests that mammoths were not suited to cold climates, the lack of sebaceous glands in the skin. Most Arctic animals have sebaceous glands to secrete oil and lubricate the skin to prevent cracking in the cold, dry air. But studies of mammoth skin have shown that their skin cells are absolutely identical to those of Indian elephants today. The idea that mammoths lived in an icy wasteland and never ate anything may be the popular image, but this misunderstanding fails to account for the 500 pounds of fresh vegetation required for their food every day. Dr. William Ferrand once wrote in an article titled "Frozen Mammoths and Modern Geology" that an apparent paradox remains, that the climate in northern Siberia was warmer than at present at some period in late glacial time, when climates elsewhere on the Earth were cooler than at present. The pole shift theory explains it easily. The North Pole was in Hudson Bay at the time. Canada was covered in an ice sheet because it was at the North Pole. It had an ice age in the same way Greenland and Antarctica have them now. They are located at the poles now. When the Laurentide ice sheet formed, evidence shows it didn't spread south from our current North Pole. The ice spread out in all directions from Hudson Bay. When the pole shifted, the North American ice sheet melted, but Siberia froze. Most lands suffered massive changes. Assuming that legends of an advanced civilization like Atlantis may have existed over 13,000 years ago, and that their civilization was destroyed when a pole shift put their homeland at much worse latitude and altitude, we often wonder if certain monuments are much older than we're taught. For example, the Great Pyramid in Egypt, which incorporates so much mathematical and scientific data in its measurements, a monument we may not even be able to duplicate today, seems unlikely to have been built as recently as mainstream Egyptologists insist it was. Dr. Robert Schoch, author of Forgotten Civilization, has helped to disprove this alleged 2,500 BC timeframe. He is most famous for proving the Sphinx in Egypt is thousands of years older than we were taught. He proved the erosion on the Sphinx is from massive rainfall, not blowing sand, and must have existed when the climate was still wet and rainy, at least 10 to 15,000 years old. At first, such an old date was countered with the comment that there were no signs of the civilization that could have been built that far back. But since 1994, the temple complex of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey has been conclusively dated to be at least 11 to 12,000 years old by the German Archaeological Institute. The Aztec capital city of Teotihuacan, the place of the gods, is aligned 15.26 degrees east of north, along with an access through the Avenue of the Dead, which, if extended far enough, crosses Hudson Bay. Was the site established before the last pole shift? Anthony Aveni, author of Sky Watchers of Ancient Mexico, wrote that of 56 Mesoamerican sites he studied, 50 of them are curiously orientated east of north. In the Old World, many sites like the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and the Ziggurat of Ur are oriented west of north. Are they originally aligned with the previous North Pole because the sites were established long before the current orientation of the globe? Thomas Mills wrote a book called Stonehenge, If This Were East, in which he concludes that the stone's arrangement only makes sense if they were aligned to the sky when the North Pole was in Hudson Bay. Ancient monuments also clue us into even more ancient North Pole locations. Baalbek, a site in Lebanon with the largest stone blocks in the world, some weighing over 400 tons, seem to be aligned properly if the North Pole were in the Norwegian Sea, east of Greenland, just where it was 2 pole shifts back, at least 25,900 years ago. And when we look up Ancient Equator on YouTube, many videos will show that many of the most impressive ancient monuments and temple sites can be found on a single line that circles the Earth, a former equator that crosses the Egyptian pyramids at Giza, Petra, Persepolis, Mohenjo-Daro, Angkor Wat, Easter Island and the Nazca Lines, and Machu Picchu in Peru, and many other sacred temple sites. We should also note that Machu Picchu and Angkor Wat are exactly opposite each other, as are Mohenjo-Daro and Easter Island, with interesting ratios and distances between several of the other sites on the line as well. Modern architecture surely has been built over these very ancient sacred sites. For if this line is an old equator, then the North Pole was near the border of southeast Alaska and the Yukon at the time. And that was 3 pole shifts back, at least 39,000 years ago. Your government and religious leaders will be quite happy if you choose to forget about cycles of destruction by pole shift. But if you're interested in learning more, the evidence is out there. On September the 30th this year, the first human spacecraft ever to orbit a comet was deliberately crashed onto its surface in order to get the closest possible pictures of the enigmatic celestial body. This will end its mission that began when the vessel was launched over 12 years ago. The European Space Agency's Rosetta probe has been circling the comet millions of miles from Earth, making unprecedented close-range observations of Comet 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko, named after the 2 astronomers who discovered it. One of the spacecraft's most significant accomplishments is to have taken readings of the comet's makeup, determining that it contains some of the basic building blocks of life. Cometary impacts, it seems, may have helped start life on Earth. But comets, such as the focus of the Rosetta mission, have also posed threats to earthly life. 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko is around 2.5 miles across. If it hit the Earth, which thankfully it won't, it could put an end to civilization as we know it. A comet, just 500 feet in diameter, is believed to have caused the Tunguska event of 1908, when it exploded over a remote area of Siberia with the force of a 15-megaton bomb, flattening 1,000 square miles of forest. But the Tunguska comet was minuscule compared to one estimated to have been around 10 miles wide, which almost collided with our planet 3,500 years ago. This comet was recorded by the Egyptians in the 22nd year of the reign of the pharaoh Thutmose III, who described it as a brilliant disk much larger than the full moon, adding that it was a marvel never before seen since that foundation of this land, Egypt. Chinese astronomers who meticulously recorded celestial occurrences for astrological purposes also noted the breathtaking event. The ancient Mawang Dui Silk Almanac, preserved in the Yunnan Provincial Museum in Changst, depicts the comet as one of the largest ever observed. Not only did it fill a large part of the sky, but it also had an astonishing 10 tails, the biggest comet observed since the birth of modern astronomy. Dr. Chezeau's comet of 1744 had only 7. The Egyptian record is found in a manuscript now in the Vatican Library called the Thule Papyrus, and a number of writers have cited it as evidence for an ancient UFO sighting, leading some scholars to question its authenticity. However, it would seem to have concerned a genuine event. The 22nd year of Thutmose III's reign is thought to have been around 1486 BC, which is precisely the year, by our modern calendar, that the Chinese observed the 10-tailed comet. The comet must have passed terrifyingly close to our planet. Indeed, the ancient comet's appearance was so spectacular that it seems to have had a profound influence on religions throughout the world. It seems that this unprecedented celestial phenomenon was taken to be the appearance of a new god. At this precise time, contemporary civilians across the globe all began to worship a new deity, depicted as a winged disk hanging in the sky. Examples include the Hittite god Kumabis, the Assyrian god Antum, the Mitannian god Aya, and the Persian god Ahura Mazda. The Assyrian winged disk, one of the many similar glyphs that represented deities that appeared throughout the world after the comet's appearance in 1486 BC. In China, a new divinity called Lao Tinye, the great god, appears at this time during the Shang dynasty, and was represented by a circle with a series of straight lines radiating in a fan shape beneath and to the side of it, which looks remarkably similar to a depiction of a comet. Fascinatingly, this glyph is almost identical to the symbol for a new god that appeared in Egypt during the reign of Thutmose III. Called the Aten, it was represented by a circle with a fan-shaped series of lines radiating from it, just like the symbol for Lao Tinye. Egyptologists have long assumed that the Aten glyph represented the sun, which no doubt it did when the pharaoh Akhenaten made Aten worship the state religion in the mid-1300s BC. but when it first appeared in the capital of Thebes over a century earlier, it is accompanied by no inscription specifically associating it with a solar deity. But the sudden appearance of new religions was not the only social upheaval to accompany the comet's close encounter with Earth. Throughout the world, there was a simultaneous and unprecedented period of violence. Egypt embarked on a vicious military campaign, conquering what are now Israel, Lebanon, and Libya. The Hittites of Turkey struck out at their neighbors in the eastern Mediterranean. In Syria, the Mitanni kingdom attacked the Assyrians of Iraq. The Kassites of northern Iran invaded Babylonia in southern Iraq. The Yaz people of Armenia ferociously attacked everyone around them. And the Harappan civilization of northwest India was wiped out by marauding tribes from Afghanistan. And all this followed a period of relative peace throughout the world that had lasted for generations. Experts generally believe that the period of intense warfare and social unrest around the world was due to a short-term climate change that saw global temperatures drop. Resultant crop failures meant the kind of scarce resources that invariably lead to conflict. The question, however, is what caused the bad weather that lasted for a decade or so? Threats to life and civilization. In 1985, astronomer Carl Sagan identified the comet of 1486 BC as Comet 12P Pons-Brooks, suggesting that a fragment of it had broken off and impacted with the Earth. The resultant explosion throwing debris high into the atmosphere and impeding the sun's rays for many years, causing global temperatures to fall. But this may not have been the only effect of the cometary impact. At the International Conference on Catastrophic Events and Mass Extinctions held in Vienna in July 2000, scientists gathered to discuss possible threats to life on Earth posed by asteroid and comet impacts. Interestingly, besides the obvious calamities such impacts would cause, such as firestorms, nuclear winters, and tsunamis, attention was drawn to various harmful chemicals that some comets contain. One of these is the amino acid vasopressin that can cause violent and aggressive behavior in humans. It is not at present known if 12P Pons-Brooks contained vasopressin, but if it does, then the substance entering the atmosphere to contaminate the food chain could in part have been responsible for the unprecedented period warfare that griped the planet in the early 1400 BC. Coincidentally, just as the Rosetta mission comes to an end, astronomers have determined that a fragment of 12P Pons-Brooks, the comet of 1486 BC, is heading for its closest approach to Earth on the 11th of February next year. The comet has broken into several pieces after a close pass with Jupiter, one of them being what is now designated as Comet 45P Honda-Magos-Pachtisakova, first identified in 1948. It is around a mile wide, but luckily it won't hit the Earth. However, it is possible that the Earth's orbit could take us through the comet's trail. Whether or not that would have an effect on our atmosphere remains to be seen. But even if it passes safely by, the main comet itself, still well over 5 miles wide, is due to return to the inner solar system in 2024. But exactly how close it will come to the Earth at present is unknown. Let's hope for the best. The last thing the world needs now is elevated levels of aggression. When the first American settlers reached the shore of the Great Salt Lake in the middle of the 19th century, many of them believed that this vast inland sea was a remnant of the floodwaters that had swept across the whole Earth in the Great Deluge. At that time, the acceptance of the biblical deluge as a real and historical event was as universal as the flood itself was believed to be, among the educated and uneducated alike. The currently accepted explanation of the Great Salt Lake's formation is much more prosaic. According to geologists, the Great Salt Lake in Utah, USA, is a remnant of a once much larger lake named Lake Bonneville that has since largely evaporated away. Supposedly, Lake Bonneville grew to such a large size because the region experienced much more precipitation during the Ice Age compared to today, and shrunk to its present size due to decreasing rainfall following the ending of the last Ice Age. Also, scientists say that the Great Salt Lake's salt originates from the rivers that bring in small amounts of dissolved salts, which then accumulate in the lake because it has no outlet. Utah's official state website confirms this. It is salty because it does not have an outlet. Tributary rivers are constantly bringing in small amounts of salt dissolved in their freshwater flow. Once again, in the Great Salt Lake, much of the water evaporates, leaving the salt behind. Here, we will argue against the currently accepted explanation of the Great Salt Lake's origin and attempt to rehabilitate the long-dismissed hypothesis of its oceanic origins. First, it is stated that the Great Salt Lake is salty because it does not have an outlet. We will not dispute that the second part of this statement, namely it does not have an outlet, is true. The Great Salt Lake certainly does not have an outlet, meaning that the rivers flow into the lake, the Bear, Weber, and Provo Jordan rivers, but no rivers flow out. Such a lake is a specific example of a general class of lakes called endorheight lakes, and the drainage basins within which these lakes are found are called endorheight basins, which are drainage basins from which no rivers flow out. The vast majority of the millions of lakes found across the world are not endorheight lakes. That is, almost all lakes have rivers that flow out of them as well as into them. The second statement in the Utah State's website official explanation reads, "Tributary rivers are constantly bringing in small amounts of salt dissolved in their freshwater flow." This statement is also true, as can be verified by a Scientific American article written by Arthur Pillsbury. All natural waters, including those described as fresh, contain salts. A virgin stream emerging from a mountain watershed may contain as little as 50 parts per million ppm of salt, or total dissolved solids. Ocean water averages about 35,000 parts per million, or about 3.5% of dissolved solids. Mr. Pillsbury then goes on to emphasize that the word salts in this context does not only mean sodium and chloride, which are primary constituents of the familiar salt table, but other ions, including but not limited to sodium, chloride, sulfate, potassium, calcium, and carbonate. Later on, he explains how these streams end up containing these minute concentrations of salt, namely through the action of weathering and erosion. Weathering takes place under conditions where there is ample opportunity for the mineral crystals that constitute rock to oxidize. Although weathering embraces physical, chemical, and biological processes, the physical processes are pervasive and central. Mechanical action fractures rock, exposing a far greater surface area to weathering agents. For example, the alternate freezing and thawing of water in the crevices of rock exerts forces of compression and expansion that can break down the strongest material. Flowing water, wind, and the grinding action of rocks in the bed of streams and the bottom of glaciers all contribute to physical weathering. Weathering manufactures both salts and the particles of rock that are borne from the uplands to the lowlands, where they are the principal constituent of soil. So far so good, or so it seems. What then are some inferences that can be drawn from these facts? The source of the salt. First is that the specific salt composition of rivers that drain a watershed will differ depending on the specific rocks and soils that make up the watershed. Given that different regions of the Earth exhibit great diversity of rocks and soils, one should expect that the profile of dissolved salts found in different rivers should correspondingly exhibit a great diversity. These conclusions are not merely plausible, but are in fact true, as this can be verified by Table 5.3, which confirms that fresh waters that drain different types of rock differ significantly in their distribution of dissolved salts. And by extension, since it is these salts dissolved in these rivers that are carried to the endorheight lakes, the salt compositions of these rivers determine the salt composition of the lakes. So we should expect the distribution of dissolved salts in a river flowing into an endorheight lake to be similar to the distribution of dissolved salts in the endorheight lake itself, as the salts dissolved in the endorheight lake originate from these self-same rivers. By contrast, the salt composition of seawater is not determined by merely the salt composition of the particular river and the rocks and soils that are found in the specific watershed that this given river drains, but is rather determined by the average of all the salt concentrations of all the world's rivers and the corresponding watersheds that these rivers drained averaged over the entire billions of years over which the oceans have existed. Given these facts, if the currently accepted geological theory of the origin of the Great Salt Lake salt is correct, which is, as was described earlier, that these salts were eroded from the rock and soils within the Great Salt Lake's watershed and then carried by rivers into the lake, then one would most certainly not expect the Great Salt Lake to have a salt composition that is nearly identical to that of seawater, as this would mean that the chemical composition of the rocks and soils that comprise the Great Salt Lake's watershed and the salts that they generate upon being eroded happened to be nearly identical to the average of the salt compositions of all the world's rivers averaged over billions of years. Given that the Great Salt Lake watershed comprises less than 1,000th of the Earth's total land area, this would be, to say the least, a most remarkable coincidence, since that would imply that a randomly picked and relatively tiny swathe of the surface of the Earth would have nearly the same distribution of rocks and soils as the average distribution of rocks and soils all over the entire Earth. And yet this most unlikeliest of coincidences happens to be true, for the Great Salt Lake salt composition is nearly identical to seawater, differing only that its waters are slightly enriched in potassium and depleted in calcium compared to the ocean. As can be seen in the table, potassium was omitted in the chart because there was no potassium concentration data for the Bear River. In fact, the salt composition of the Great Salt Lake is more similar to the seawater than it is to the very river, namely the Bear River, that feeds it and supposedly the source of its salts. A lake of seawater. This chart weakens the currently accepted theory in two different ways. First, we've demonstrated earlier that Endor Height Lake and the river which feeds it should have similar salt profiles, and this is clearly not the case. Secondly, we've demonstrated that it's extremely unlikely that the Great Salt Lake and Endor Height Lake and seawater should have similar salt properties, provided that the currently accepted theory of the origin of the Great Salt Lake salts is correct. Therefore, one may conclude that, in all probability, the currently accepted explanation for the origin of the salts of the Great Salt Lake, namely that the salts have been eroded from the rocks and soils found in the lake's watershed and carried to the lake by the rivers that flow into it, is incorrect with a very high probability, for one can only maintain that this is true by resorting to coincidence, which is by definition a very low probability. Since there is only one point of origin of these salts, namely the ocean, one is compelled to admit the possibility that these salts originated from the ocean. But this must mean that the ocean at one point in the past penetrated the Great Salt Lake's watershed, which is located almost 600 miles away from the nearest ocean, the Pacific Ocean. Perhaps the impressions of the American settlers who first cast eyes on the Great Salt Lake and thought that it was the work of God were correct after all.